Staff Sergeant Gary Lamb hanged himself from the fourth-floor window of St. Ogilvy General on April 15, 2011. It took EMTs 6 minutes to break through the door he'd jammed shut and cut him down. By then, he'd shorn off 6 out of 8 fingernails, digging bloody furrows into his neck, and his face had swollen to the tender consistency and color of an overripe grape. This was not to mention his tongue thrust out and nearly severed by an involuntarily clenching jaw, or the stains slicking the bottom half of his hospital gown. You didn't need a medical license to know to start unrolling the body bag. 6 minutes is eternity to an asphyxiating man, but during that time the rapidly growing crowd in the parking lot was treated to a second horrifying spectacle. As Gary Lamb listed to and fro in the wind, a woman, a nurse perhaps, was trying and failing to pull him back into the room. Of course, the only thing she thought to pull on was the rope itself, an act that served little but to jerk and hitch the man like some kind of macabre puppet. In order to truly get Southeast Asian horror, if you're not already from there, you need to understand that we see our countries very differently from the way you do. The common perception can be found splashed across countless blogs and perfectly curated social media pages. Pristine beaches, charming street vendors, picture-perfect weather, often shared by college graduates intent on finding themselves on a gap year. Not quite my experience. See, those of us who grew up here don't remember frolicking on the beach or going on bar crawls with our attractive friends from the hostel. We remember the heat, for one. Oppressive, ever-present, and coupled with a thick, cloying humidity that sears your eyes and smothers any semblance of rational thought. We also remember old cautionary tales of horrors that follow you home because of a poorly timed, poorly phrased comment. Things that show up not on your doorstep but on your ceiling. Things that grab your hand as you reach for a light switch, or your ankles when you're swimming alone. Things that, as the rainforests were replaced by monoliths of glass and steel, weren't intimidated in the slightest by the advent of modernity. Maybe that's why the only time I feel safe writing about this is from an apartment in Los Angeles, several continents away. The majority of my stories come from the time I spent in the military. While I've never personally seen or experienced anything during my service, the fact that we spent our time crawling through rainforest muck in the oldest parts of the country meant I met no shortage of servicemen with their share of supernatural trauma. Someone who often regaled me with stories was a technical first sergeant attached to our unit. I can't remember his name, but he and I spent many nights on guard duty at Tower Number 3, overlooking a lonely moonlit airfield. He was leaning over the guardrail with a cigarette, puffing acrid smoke that I was surreptitiously and futilely trying to waft away, when he told me his first story. You know Gary didn't kill himself, right? Gary was a smaller guy, maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, and it was undoubtedly a source of his chronic insecurity. Maybe that's why he was also 130 pounds of grade a dickhead. The 38-year-old staff sergeant had a permanent scowl etched into his face as he skulked around the base, and he had his own supernatural ability to conjure busywork for newly inducted servicemen. It was little surprise to find out that he was no patron saint in his personal life, either. His girlfriend Elena was a high school sweetheart who always knew she could do better but never quite found the courage to be single. She listened, sometimes forlornly, sometimes resentfully, as her friends described whirlwind hookups, blush-inducing trysts, and ridiculous, expensive gestures lavished upon them by an unending stream of suitors. Then she watched, as her group of friends eventually distilled the perfect man from the chaos of single adult life and settled down for an eternity in paradise. A paradise, she'd come to realize, that she was never going to have. Very little of this was true, of course. Her friends, like normal human beings, had struggles and inadequacies too. The debilitating depression that dominated most of her life simply made the grass appear greener wherever she looked. But it certainly didn't help that Gary had none of the qualities her friends gushed about. From her point of view, it looked like the man simply stopped putting in any effort the second they became official. No romantic poems. No surprise anniversary gifts. Just a gray, placid coexistence in their two-bedroom apartment, a blur of waking up, going to work, coming home, and falling asleep as they bled their lives away. Perhaps it was because she felt she had so little that she sought to hold onto the scraps of her relationship with a vice grip. In the final year of their relationship, she'd become possessed with fears of her beau's potential infidelity. Whether this manifested in non-stop texts he discreetly tried to answer during ops briefings, or her showing up at the guardhouse to verify he was where he said he was, her resentment turned to obsession remarkably and disturbingly quickly. And she was right. Turns out our staff sergeant was more of a doer than a dreamer, because Elena came home one night to find him in bed with a 20-something from the club, writhing and moving with a passion that she'd never experienced once in her life. The meltdown was historic. She showed up at the camp the next day in a maelstrom of melodrama, clutching the rusted wrought iron gates as she screamed hellfire. The poor MP on duty had to pry the wiry woman off the gate after trying unsuccessfully to cajole her off her bloodied knees. Eventually, swearing revenge at the staff sergeant cowering in his office, she stormed off. That same day, dressed in all red, she flung herself out the window of their 8-story apartment. In a particularly vengeful twist, she tried to time it right as Gary was coming home from work. Fortunately for him, the sight was already a blur of sirens and police tape as he arrived, and by then the grisly, broken display was already covered by a tarp. Still, the little detail about her choice of clothing did not escape the staff sergeant. See, Elena was a Chinese woman, and the color red holds special significance in her culture. In fact, red is held to a sacred level in traditional Chinese culture, to the extent it is splashed everywhere at every opportunity. Just think of the last Chinese restaurant you've been to. This is no surprise, given that it's often associated with joy, vitality, and energy. All wonderful things to ascribe to a living, breathing person. When it comes to death, though, the color we're looking for is white, representing resolution, peace and finality. When someone kills themselves while wearing a color inverting this custom, it is a perversion of sanctity somewhere on par with hanging the cross upside down. The intention behind it was unmistakable. Elena did not intend to shuffle off this mortal coil quite yet. And she certainly wasn't going to do it alone. This was a uniquely terrifying prospect to an already guilt-ridden Gary. So much so, that he sought out the help of a Taoist priest the very same day. Taoist priests are renowned for their experience with appeasing or purging the restless undead, and their advice is often treated as gospel by the afflicted. This priest conferred no moral judgment upon hearing the story, but understood the magnitude of the wrath about to be visited on the hapless man. The spirit, said the medium, would roam the earth for 41 days, if she returned at all. If he was able to evade her for that long, her hold over him would cease, and all would be back to normal. But how would he know she was coming? You'll hear her jumping. The image of a dead woman hopping around the apartment was equal parts ridiculous, horrifying, and comical. Yes, she won't be able to bend over, so hide under something. A bed, for example. She can only look for you for so long before she has to move on. Well, the man had spoken. No point further questioning his advice. Gary left the temple and went home, doubt festering in his mind. 41 days. The next month was spent in a feverish haze of fear, grief, and paranoia. The first sergeant remembers Gary flinching at every noise, wide-eyed and sweaty.